You couldn't tell them that they're feeling anything other than what they're feeling, and they'd be right. But take your blindfolds off, and you're all looking at a view of the same thing. And all of those things are true, but they're not the whole truth.
Welcome to the Let Me Save You 25 Years podcast. I am your host, Shawn D. Nelson. And first, thank you. Thank you so much for all the support on social media. I spend an inordinate amount of time on Instagram, especially. So slide into my DMs. Honestly, I DM with customers, employees, listeners of the podcast all the time. You know, I'm the CEO of a public company. And I think it's hopefully kind of rare to be able to just, access me directly. I love it though. It's what keeps me plugged into my customers, what keeps me plugged into reality. And I'd love to hear from you there. I'd love to get your feedback. I'd love to hear what you're liking, not liking. Of course, love you to like and share the podcast, give it a 5-star review. Heck yeah. We're building it. I'm having some great conversations with the world's most talented people. And today it's the same. You're going to love this. We're getting into this topic today. You are the solution. You are the solution is what I'm saying. And I think so often, let me tell you where it came from. As a Shawnism, I found myself in about 2014 in a place where I had some very talented people running a lot of aspects of Lovesac, but we were kind of on a treadmill that wasn't getting to the next level. And I had to make some big changes that really felt risky and take the company in a whole new direction from really where my top team was driving it. And we made some dramatic changes that year. And I had to really accept that I am the solution. Like if we are going to survive in a tough environment with competition, I had to trust myself. I had to trust my gut, my instincts, and I had to step up and be the solution. If I just relied on others or I just allowed inertia to take over, I knew that we were not going to end in the place where I needed Lovesac to end up. And whether it's every day, whether it's as dramatic as that, whether it's just amongst our friends and the way that we show up, be the solution. You are the solution. Don't just be blown around. So we get into it in great depth with today's guest, who is perfect for this topic. We get political. This guest has got a really interesting point of view on politics. Right now in this country, depending on the media that you're taking in, you might be living in a completely different reality than your next door neighbor who might be taking in media from a completely different place, which leads us to the idea of getting outside of our own echo chambers. We talk about how to do that. We talk about where to seek out the best sources. We talk about some very practical solutions to taking control of our own agency and not being manipulated by others, which whether you want to admit it or not, there are the strongest forces perhaps in the universe trying to hijack our agency, sometimes including our own lizard brain, which we talk about on this podcast today. The importance of honesty and integrity in exercising our agency. The problems with mainstream journalism today, we get into that. And Sami, our guest, is one of these honest sources, I believe, regardless of whether you agree with her politics, one of these honest sources that is, trying to have honest discourse. And that's what we need around us. You don't need to agree with people. You just need people who are intelligent enough to be able to hold two ideas in their mind at once and not just, put on the earmuffs, la, 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 I can't hear you. Right. Those are the kinds of people that I hope listen to this podcast. That's the kind of person I try to be. And as we move through this world, right, we have to make our own moves, or the world will move you in the direction that it wants to move you. It's all tied up in today's Shawnism. You are the solution. I go deep with one of media's foremost influencers now, and someone who you may not have been exposed to before. I think you're going to love this conversation. Check it out. Today's guest is someone who doesn't just talk about problems, which drives me crazy. She jumps in and solves them. She's the co-founder of Betches Media, a powerhouse brand that transformed from a college blog into a cultural media empire with millions and millions of followers and a fiercely loyal audience. She is the host of the daily podcast, The Morning Announcements, and the author of the New York Times bestseller, Democracy in Retrograde, a refreshingly real guide to reclaiming your power and creating real change, both in the world and in your own life. She's built an empire around this by not just waiting for others to fix things. She's sharp, she's bold, she's not waiting for permission to take action. And that's exactly what we're talking about today. Shawnism. You are the solution. Please welcome the sharp, savvy, and unstoppable Sami Sane.
Thank you. That is such a flattering introduction. I really appreciate it.
Hey, it's all true. And look, without even thinking too hard, Sami, right? When you heard the Shawnism, you are the solution. It's the first thing that came to mind.
Don't sit around and wait for other people to solve your problem or wait for a problem to sort of solve itself. And your agency is the most important thing you have. And I think even sometimes when I think even taking that like mental attack just generally as a way that you look at situations is helpful, even if in some situations you might not be the solution, because I think it's probably a better thing to sort of over index on your own agency than under index on it, if you know what I mean
Yes,
by that.
yes, I love that.
Because that also means that you're taking responsibility when it might be easier to be able to say, there's all these factors
Yeah.
that are preventing you from finding a solution. And those things are really there. It's really true, and it might be helpful to analyze and to explain to yourself or to take a lesson for the future. But at the end of the day, if you want to be able to take credit for things, you also kind of have to take the blame
Yeah.
sometimes.
I love that. Look, so Lovesac gets to employ 2,000 people. We've built a culture I'm really proud of. We're really adamant about celebrating our values and different Shawnisms. Actually, as we talk about our culture, one of them that's kind of stuck is we throw around here is this phrase, "It's your fault." And I talk about it a little bit in my book. This idea that what this "it's your fault" little Shawnism means is like, try to take responsibility for everything, even the stuff that seems like it's out of your control, stuff, or, some things that other people have done maybe to you or around you or somehow affected you. Like, hey, what could I have done to not been in the way? What could I have done to not allowed them to affect me that way? What could I have done differently to, not be in a position where that person could harm me, whatever it might be, right? Even things that happen to us, taking responsibility for it, this idea that it's your fault. So you calling it out, right? I love what you said. Choose it as your default modus operandi. Even if it's kind of not true, like, hey, I couldn't control this, or this happened to me, or even happened to the world. I'm still going to ask that first question, like, how could I make this my fault? As I say it anyway. That's cool.
I don't know how familiar you are with like the TikTok trends of kind of people over therapizing things. And, I think that sort of has primed people to take maybe less responsibility for things.
Mm.
Maybe in the past, people were super hard on themselves. And so I do think it can be helpful to learn how to speak to yourself with compassion. Um, and, maybe it's not the most helpful mindset for someone who's already really prone to beating themselves up, that
Mm.
everything
Yeah.
is kind of their responsibility or theirs to fix, because as we know, it's not really true. But I do think that in any situation, there is so much more nuance than we want to naturally think there is.
Yeah.
Or, even, in a relationship or a friendship, it's like this person's like this and so I'm like this. But I think more than anything, the way people are around each other tends to have sort of like an alchemy that makes it all of our collective responsibility.
Hmm.
And that is the case. And spending time parsing through how much responsibility or credit belongs to who, those are ultimately, in some ways, they're important, but I think in some ways people kind of stew on that for the protection of their own ego.
Yeah.
And it's much harder. The more uncomfortable thing is to analyze the ways in which it's your fault, kind of putting yourself in the other person's head and thinking, uh, how do they see me in this? Like, how
Hmm.
I see them as this and me as this, but how does it work the opposite way? And it's I think it's mentally uncomfortable to be thinking about that, but I also think that that is like the part where you grow and where relationships are strengthened and challenges are overcome. And it's unfortunate that to pass through those kind of harder things in life, you do really have to uh you have to push through that.
Yeah. I agree. I really like this idea of exercising your ability to kind of hold two thoughts at the same time. I think that's fundamentally, one, I think, definition of intelligence, right? The ability to both, for instance, as we discussed, own it, you know, take responsibility, even as a mental exercise, even as in the back of your mind, hey, look, this person did this, or, the situation is totally messed up. But you still go through this mental exercise of asking the question, what still could I have done differently? And I think if you can do that and hold those two thoughts simultaneously, you can both be easy on yourself, right? Because you don't just have to like internalize everything and take responsibility for the world, but at the same time, hold yourself accountable, where I think more and more people just don't, or just don't, by the way, want to think about it. They want to just, blow it off and move on, or, block someone or unfriend them, whatever it may be. And I just think, everything has more nuance. You get into a lot of, obviously, you're heavy into politics. Um, you have deeply, as I've observed, you're deeply passionate about a lot of things in the political realm, and there is a lot of nuance. Nothing is as simple as media typically would make it out to be. And I just really appreciate people who can demonstrate the intelligence of, hearing two things, understanding two things, understanding where people come from, and then still, by the way, exercise their agency to be passionate, as opposed to just being dismissive of everything.
Thank you. I mean, I've worked for that probably 20 years, and
Yeah.
I still am trying to, be more sort of like 360 in the way I look at things. And I think that part of why it is helpful to be able to see other things is that I can understand what is actually persuasive to people who don't already agree with me. Because I think right now we're in a space where most people are getting their news from social media. A lot of that discourse is so deeply manipulated by various actors, and I don't think people necessarily realize the extent to which our discourse is manipulated, and to which we would be thinking about kind of an entirely different set of things if the
Yep.
internet were actually organic at this point. Um, and I think, I mean, I know that the platforms that we function on, that we run our businesses on as well, profit off of anger and rage and things that are outrageous and not necessarily true. But then, I'll even read the most sensational sounding headline. And if you look into certain things, or if you ask someone who's more familiar with the ins and outs of how, congressional procedure or something like that works, you actually understand how that headline gets formed.
Mm.
people trust you more if you can sort of elucidate that for them
Yeah.
rather than regurgitating what are the resistance libs saying today.
Yeah.
And it is a hard space to function in terms of nuance. I've followed the news my whole life. I just have a natural interest in it. I feel like I wish more people understood how relevant it actually is to the contours of their lives.
Yeah.
Um, that even if you're not paying attention, there's so much of just how everyone has been brought to their own present day position that has been impacted by generations before them.
Yeah.
And I'm very curious about how that came to be.
Yeah. Look, I think it may even be impossible to completely um, unwind and understand at this point. There are so many layers, like you said, in our society that we live in. Like I'm having a hard time sometimes as I listen to podcasts, as I read books. I'm always reading. I have, you know, always been reading books my whole life for, I don't know, as long as I've been an adult, right? And I feel like at this point, it's hard to even know historically what's true anymore because there are so many different takes on things. And that's why, as a, I don't want to give up either, right? So I will continue to read, I will continue to pursue truth and knowledge. And I think for me anyway, my, I believe the most effective thing in my life is to really push myself to take in many sources and always consider the source. So, like for instance, I purposely have a podcast feed that is full of stuff, both on the left and on the right. And I think a lot of people, and that's just the political realm, we could get into other realms as well. But sadly, like right now in our country, I believe that a lot of people are experiencing two different realities. It is remarkable. Like if you have the stomach to follow what Doge is putting out transparently, and you simultaneously have the stomach to, pick your mainstream media source, pick other media sources. Um, they are different realities. I mean, like people that only take in one side, pick your side, doesn't matter, literally live
Yeah.
on different planets. They do not know what's happening from the other point of view. And the sad thing is like it does not need to be that way, but it takes a lot of personal. Have you read Jonathan Haidt? Did you read um
I'm very familiar with his book.
very
And
interesting.
yeah,
Oh God, what's the title? It's
The Anxious
it's
Generation.
no,
Or the
before
one
the Anxious
before it,
Generation.
The Coddling of the American
No,
Mind.
not
Is
that
that
one, not that one. Hang on, I gotta pull it up. But uh it's essentially a discourse on why people lean left or why people lean right. Like why, and it gets into our genetics. It gets into just the way that, we're brought up. It's so fascinating, how that works. And I just think like, sadly, and I think he makes a great case that people to a large extent aren't even in control of it. They're
no?
sort of born that way. And we could agree with that or not agree with it. It's just an interesting point of view.
Well, I think
But
it's that plus we now have these platforms that work psychographically on those traits that actually we're predisposed to think a certain way. And then we literally are handed these objects that reflect that reality and enhance it and put it on steroids
yeah,
and then invite you to argue with people about it who live in the alternate reality. And in fact, what they actually do, something I'm very familiar, I'm very interested in following like the landscape on new media. Like how are the actual how do you identify a bot campaign? How do you know what's really organic? Who is seeing what? Especially because now we have all these, there's all this reporting about our, comments about how like Gen Z doesn't get their opinions from the content. They get it from the comments. And, people can't even finish a whole book anymore. And they're just forming their opinions based on sort of these very shallow pieces of information and tidbits that they're essentially primed to be agreeing with. So some people will go to a comment section, the same comment section, and they'll see a different set of comments that are surfaced than someone else who has a different algorithm.
Yeah.
So our realities are deeply incongruous. And something I will say that is a very, I would say, like, in terms of you are the solution in this, in trying to fix this. The solution is to actually talk to people who are not existing in your world, if you can handle it. And obviously
Uh-huh.
not everyone can talk to someone who,
Yeah.
like, if you're trans and someone thinks you don't exist, sure, maybe you don't want to engage in that conversation. But for someone who just, it's a little uncomfortable, I think it's really important that we have these face-to-face talks and conversations and, like, try to understand why people believe things,
Yeah.
and at least just, like, give them a space to see why the other side is not so bad,
Mhm.
or maybe that they're not inherently evil because they hold a belief even if it's false.
Yeah.
And I don't think that, like, by shunning the other side, you will get anywhere. You just won't.
Yeah. Well, and so I'll recommend to you, but really to anyone listening, the book by Jonathan Haidt that really affected me, and really I think supports everything you're saying right now, is called The Righteous Mind. And after I finished this book, I kind of felt like, man, I kind of wish every person in America was somehow compelled to read this book, because it just makes such a great case for the fact that um, it's not even necessarily there is no right or wrong in many respects. It's people, like you said, have both been genetically disposed as well as culturally, and they can change, by the way. It's nurture or nature, right? But and both can have a massive effect on people. And sadly, if, like you, I like how you put it, if people are not developed enough to handle tough conversations or handle their framework being challenged, they will be found in an echo chamber, because I think neutral media for the most part is dead. It's impossible to make money in that model. I used to dream of, starting a media company that was somehow just down the middle. But the problem is, that age old line, that goes probably back to the earliest days, the 18th, the 19th century, if it bleeds, it leads. Well, you pull that thread all the way through. Anything, the more dramatic, the more traumatic, the more eyeballs it will pull. And so therefore, down the middle media won't work. And the sad thing is that's what we need in a perfect world. But we live in a very imperfect world. And in fact, the book that supports that, if I can throw that out there for listeners as well, The Chaos Machine, is really something you're pushing on, that these, particularly social media machines, people perceive them as leaning right or left, depending on how they experience them. But really, especially if you watch the behavior of, say, the founders, they don't care. They're happy to just see the discord, because the discord, back to that line, right? If it bleeds, it leads, and we're sitting there cutting each other and just creating billions for that machine.
Well, what I like to say is that there is no red or blue, there is only green.
Mm.
And I think
What
what
do you mean by
maybe
that?
is not, it's all about money. And I think when you actually look up close at the government, and you could take this back a few decades, you could take it back to 2010 with Citizens United, where the fact is that, and I think if you speak to a lot of people who are on either side, who are not happy with the government in general. Like
Yeah.
right now, and I think, if you want to analyze the election, part of why I think Kamala Harris was not successful is because she campaigned as like an establishment candidate. We're going to just kind of do more of the same. Nothing's going to change. And what people wanted, even people who were Biden voters, who were Obama voters, those people were like, no, anything but this. And a few other factors, came into play. And ultimately, this is an anti-establishment time. I think that Americans have been looking for anti-establishment since the Great Recession, to be honest with you, because I think what happened there, and that's where this, if it's not red or blue, it's green, really came to the forefront, because you had the situation where the federal government bailed out the wealthiest. And people, that's what started this sort of, I think, like what, call it the last 10 years. That's what got Trump ultimately elected, was this like hollowing out and of the Midwest and of American industry, which now we're still talking about with the tariffs, which is its own thing. But
by the way, let's say it differently. The everyday taxpayer bailed out the wealthiest.
Yes.
How messed up is
bailed
that?
out the wealthiest. Yes. And, shortly after that, Citizens United, which basically allowed corporations and wealthy donors to donate infinite amounts of money to political campaigns, to the point where it now costs tens of millions of dollars to win a House of Representatives seat every 2 years. And when people are angry at the establishment, what they're angry at is corporate capture. And why I think the Democrats are particularly unpersuasive is because people don't see them as like the lesser of two evils. They see them as also captured by moneyed interest. They see Nancy Pelosi and her stock portfolio. And it's not just her, because they've all been there. They've
by
all
the
been
way,
there. They're letting themselves trade these stocks. It's not,
if you
both
think
sides.
it's not just trading stocks either. If you think the left are the ones captured or the right are the ones captured,
No, the whole
the
thing.
answer is you're right. It's all of them. And I'm sure, and I don't mean to, look, I'm sure that somewhere among them exists some, I don't know, uncaptured individuals. Maybe to be honest, I'm not even sure. I don't think so.
Look, I'm sure there are some, but the point is, there's just no point in generalizing it. But the point is that that person can't do anything because the system is captured. The American people understand this, and that's why they were willing to roll the dice with Donald Trump again.
And by the way, it's not just corporate. It's cartels that extend beyond
billionaires, foreign governments,
the intelligence community, pharmaceuticals, these massive
industries.
What do you even call them? Organizations.
You would call them industries. They're not going. The United States is not going to reduce its defense budget. And the other thing is that I don't think people realized how much of the American economy is dependent on the federal government paying companies to do things for the federal government.
Yeah.
And that is partly why, you're never going to get a new jet company, because all the federal contracts are going to go to Boeing. And that's the whole industry. And you basically have kind of monopolies, several monopolies in the American economy. And I think people are just fed up, and it affects their lives. They understand, because everyone can see on social media how nice billionaires are living, how nice millionaires are living, how great it is in Saint-Tropez. Like, people can see that they have been cheated of something.
Yeah.
Millennials know that they can't afford a house, and
maybe never will.
They can't find a house. Like, there's just so much to this that's why people are angry, and the social media platforms and the moneyed interests are able to capitalize on all of that. And, I don't want to say like that's the root of it all, but if you took money out of politics, I think you would see a big change.
Oh yeah. I mean, let me look, I want to get back to the solutions, right? That's the whole topic of today. You are the solution. We'll go there. But before we do, indulge me on one thing, because I love, it's rare on this podcast I have someone as actively political as you are, and is, well versed in that realm. I haven't seen this said this way. Maybe I'm not reading enough, but I think it's also super confusing for people, because in my observation, the parties have flipped. And what I mean by that is, think about how you just described Kamala's campaign, more of the same. Well, that by definition defines conservatism. We
Mhm.
want more of the same, and we don't want change.
Yeah.
And I think so much power has been achieved by the liberal establishment that they're the new conservatives. They're the new prudes. It was always like the conservatives were the prudes. The conservatives were the ones who were like, oh, we can't have, we can't say sex on the air. The conservatives were, and all of a
Yeah.
sudden through uh, just everything that's transpired over the last, pick a
The
number, 30,
culture
40
war.
years, I almost feel like liberalism is the new conservative, and conservatism, they're now the activists looking for change, looking to tear it down, like looking to be anti-establishment. And it's like, that is really trippy because by definition, the roles
Right.
have changed.
Well, what I think I agree with you that the roles have changed, but what I actually think has happened is that to try to put this on a left, right, liberal, conservative spectrum is actually just pointless now. Like,
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that's actually what you're seeing because it's not quite that they flipped. Like, it's not that's not totally what's happened, but they
Fair.
no longer are defined in the ways that we would have thought that they would have been defined up until 2000, 2004. And yes, what you're seeing is correct, and I think what the right now, I think the terms like far right and far left only serve as like cultural labels to signal that something is good or bad or something, but those
Okay.
labels don't actually apply to an ideology. And I think that in part, some of what we're seeing as ideology from the parties and from, I don't even want to say the parties, like, but from the most vocal people within them. So you have Donald Trump and you have Tucker Carlson and people who really pushed, I would say, throughout the whole Biden administration, primarily culture war stories about like the green trans M&M or some like stupid thing and like girls sports. It's like those are issues that affect so few people, and that's such an it's such an obsessive focus on the right. And then on the left, you have a very similar focus on like sort of aesthetic cosmopolitan concerns that just belie that no one in the beltway really understands what the average person is talking about, and they were talking about how Joe Biden is too old. And it's like these things are not that people stake themselves on are not actually policy. Like, how often do you actually see people discussing, and I'm not saying this never happens, but there should be much more talk about, like, how are we getting people healthcare? There was the United CEO was shot down in the middle of the street, less than a year ago, and there is not really any talk of how anyone's fixing the health insurance system.
Well, because I think to your point, meanwhile, while we're all arguing about every kind of fringe issue, or frankly about anything, doesn't matter, those machines, whether it's, we mentioned some of them earlier, are continue to just churn out billions for the people who are really pulling strings behind. So the more that you and I, or whatever, the more than anybody can argue with their neighbor about anything, or by the way, just agree with their, echo chamber about anything, busy focused on, frankly, they don't care what you're focused on, as long as it's not the fact that somebody's making the weapons that are being deployed by both Russia and Ukraine. Somebody's
Mhm.
going to get the contracts to rebuild both in Russia and Ukraine. And by the way, I don't think we'd have to look very far to find a lot of the same names that rebuilt Afghanistan, rebuilt Iraq, because they made money on both ends. And that's just to pick on the war machine, right? We could pick on anything else. And so, look, I think we could go on for hours litigating that. I think to try to pull it back to what you represent in your book and this Shawnism, you are the solution. I want to dig in for 1 second on, because I'd be remiss if we ran out of time. I want to dig in on agency, because I think that there is something so fundamental that you have tapped into that, by the way, I don't hear talked about a lot, and I really appreciate it. I think that agency is one of the fundamental forces in the universe. I think it defines people's soul, people's existence. If it's not agency, then what is it? Is it does bag of blood that, we get to roam around in, for X amount of years before it gets too stiff to move. And so talk to me about that for a minute, and maybe relate it back to how we can be the solution and be empowered to take action and not feel overwhelmed by all of this monstrosity that, seems to be running things.
Right. Well, it's hard to talk about agency without talking about, privilege to some degree,
Okay.
because some people are in a place where they don't really have to build their agency or try different tacts in order to achieve their ends. Some
Hmm.
people, have it easier. Take like the nepo baby conversation, for example. You know, the person whose parents, let's take two equally talented individuals. One person who comes from bumblefuck and one person whose parents own the studio. Obviously, the parents owning the studio, it doesn't mean that, their kid isn't talented and can't do a great job, but they didn't have to really acquire that in the same way that someone who starts in bumblefuck and is in school plays and, moves to LA with no money and has to find an agent, like the things that that person had to do to push themselves to get into that first audition that the studio head's kid walks into is a whole stack of things that that really, like, what you just said, define one's life. And again, that doesn't mean that one is technically better than another, but the things that one, the kid who gets to walk in and has the job, they have an innate sense of agency. Like, I can walk in and the world is going to fulfill that for them.
Hmm.
Now, the person who comes from wherever and with no advantages, they get there. That's, that person has built that agency because they didn't, no one told, no one said like, you're destined for it. You're just gonna get it. And I think that most people fall somewhere in the middle where they have, everyone kind of has, their little advantages or they don't. But I think that it's something that you can train yourself to have. Like,
Mm-hmm.
it just because like things necessarily will not come easy to most people at some point or another. But you can choose to try something else. You can choose to not be the fish swimming with the current or just being floated on the current. Sometimes having agency when you are trying to fight a current like that, trying to fight gravity in some way for in whatever situation you're in, sometimes just standing in one place is that agency. And I
Hmm.
think, like, I'll give an example with how I try to apply this. So I make content on the internet, and here I've been complaining about how divisive political content
Mm-hmm.
is, and the algorithm just feeds you stuff and whatever, and it's not constructive. So how am I saying that when that's like literally what I do?
Yeah.
I will say that what my approach is, and I for a long time didn't put my face to things, like, and I didn't want to, I just didn't really feel like, I needed to be the one, be the spokesperson or putting it out there. But when I did, I did it because I felt like I have a really, really fulsome understanding of how things work, more than a lot of people who are reporting or explaining things on the internet. And I promised myself that I was not going to seek the algorithm. And I try to really not do that. And that, you know, you'll see some of my videos, they're like 15 minutes long. Like, if I feel like it takes 15 minutes to explain something in a way that is actually necessary that people understand, I will make a 15-minute video.
Yeah, I've seen
I
that. I
don't
like
put
that.
things out. Thank you. I don't put things out if I feel, just because like they're the topic and people are talking about it, if I don't think it's really interesting and if I don't feel like I can add something. And in a world where so many people are just talking and talking and talking, I try very hard to make sure that if I'm going to come out and say anything anywhere, it's going to be at least a 4 out of 5, in terms of like quality or substance, or it's not just going to toe the line of something that I feel like people would expect me to say. And that's what I mean by like staying in one place. I'm someone who built my whole job, career, brand on the internet. That's what people do at this point. And my promise to myself is to like not contribute to a discourse that is degrading.
Yeah.
Um, so I do that whether the algorithm likes it or not.
Yeah, I found
Yeah,
as I've, viewed some of your stuff, I found that your explanations feel more considered than a lot of stuff that's out there, and I think honest. I think there's some honesty to it, right? Like even a bunch of the things that you said on this podcast,
I appreciate
where
that. Yeah.
no, I think it's important because I think that that's what's so appalling is what's amazing is I think that in a lot of the most accepted or respected circles of journalism, there is a lot of bald-faced lying going on, just outright. And by lying, I think maybe most of it is omission, but it's still lying. It's like, your kid failed to mention that they, dented the car. It's still lying, right? Well, I never told you I didn't, right? So and it's wild to me. And so I think like finding honest sources like you on either side or any side, who cares about sides, is one of the first steps to being part of the solution, because those of us who are not creating media are taking it in, hopefully, and aren't just, checking out. And I think that's a great takeaway for me, is just to really be seeking out. And even if you don't agree, like I listen to some podcasts that I fundamentally don't agree on, let's just say politically or whatever, with the point of view generally of that speaker, let's say, host, whatever. But I appreciate that the host is honest, and it helps me understand the world better. But it's hard to find honest sources.
Well, it's hard because some people think they're being honest and other people think that that person is I think that's one of the hardest things, is that even parsing it is difficult to
Yeah.
see like who actually I look, I think some of it requires like a little bit of judgment. I try to always show my sources. So that is like one thing I'll really actively try to do. So you can see, this was written here, because I'm not a journalist. I'm not verifying these things. But one other thing you were just saying about, people in the sort of mainstream media, or just really in general, who that they don't even like believe what they're saying. One thing that I find that I didn't necessarily realize until maybe 5 years ago is how much of the journalism that we see published is dependent on access to the sources, to the principal, to somebody important, or to and there are other incentives, because the media is largely, it's always been a ratings game. It's always been a readership circulation game. So they have incentives to want to be given access by these bigger figures so that they can continue to get scoops or continue to get information. So there's like this coziness that makes it hard to ever get the real story from one person. And unless you're looking at like, call it public records. And actually that's something that if people want to kind of understand like how to parse through real journalism, I find one of the most that I find the best journalists to be people who parse through just like public records. It's like you can't really argue with someone's LLC filing. You can't really argue with this data set that it comes from this organization, and maybe you want to say, oh, I don't trust that organization, but here's the data set and here's the finding. And I find that like if you're gonna so much is reliant on quotes from people who have other motives, or journalists who want to get another scoop so from this person on a different topic, so they'll put out a different story because you don't know why they want to put that
Yeah.
out, but they do.
Yeah.
And,
And it's not
you
always even
know,
the journalist. It can be the
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 paper.
corporation that the journalist
Yeah,
has to answer to, because they, by the way, they're paying a
exactly.
mortgage like the rest of us. And it's hard to
Yeah.
blame someone, to try to not go lose their job over one story or what have you, right?
And that
And so
brings me
their
back to
agency's
it's not red
hijacked.
or blue. It's
When it comes
green.
back to it comes back to agency, because in that situation, that person's agency is being, hijacked or held for ransom. And I think it's a lot to ask someone. If you're trying to die on every hill, you're not going to make it very far in the war.
Exactly. Exactly. And that comes back to the motivation, which is that, I think people think, oh, they assume, oh, the New York Times, so biased. So, or, the Wall Street Journal, so in the tank for whomever. And people make these assumptions, but they don't realize that. And, not to say there's nothing, people are writing headlines a certain way. People want to, it's not that there are no interests, but the individual journalists, for the most part, just want to do a good job. And these institutions are made up of people who are trying to please someone who's telling them that they want something, that their performance is based on the number of page views they get. And so they're tempted to be a little bit more loose in how they present a situation, or omit something that would make it seem less scandalous if they
Yeah.
included that fact. Like,
Yeah.
it's just difficult.
So one of the places, just to get practical for listeners, one of the places that I find to be more useful to me anyway is long form podcasting. I just think it's really changed the game, where you can listen to someone for 1 or 2 or 3 hours and start to form your own opinion on whether this person's full of crap, or, partly full of crap, or has something
Or
really
maybe they have
interesting to say.
some. Yeah, or make someone can also be full of crap, but, like, you pick up a piece of information,
Yeah.
and that doesn't make that piece of information false just because it came out of a piece of crap's mouth. Like,
Yeah.
there's it's hard. It's definitely hard. But you mentioned reading. I think reading is like, such a quaint gem these days.
I know. And I push myself to read real books, and it's not always easy, because it's easy to fall. I love audiobooks. I love listening. I love podcasts. I'm a very audio centric person. I learned that way. But because I got started before any of this reading real books, I kind of make it a point. Like, I have this mantra that I say to myself every day. And one of the lines in there is, on planes, because I find myself on planes a lot, I read or I write books. And I try to really stick to that. And I find it, because it's different. I find that, after I've listened to a lot of audiobooks or podcasts, when I get back to the pulp, the act of underlining, I always read with a pen in my hand, the act of
Me
making
too.
notes in the margin is a real game changer. And seeking out the best books. Because, by the way, some of these books have been politicized, but in my humble opinion, are not. Like, I think, I'm not even sure, Jonathan Haidt has probably been politicized. But I can tell you that book, The Righteous Mind, is a very special one. And I think I can't see a way that anyone on the left or the right can take issue with it. But I don't know. It's, who knows? But
I mean, even if people take issue with it, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have value. And I think it's interesting that you're bringing it up with respect to this book and the points that are within it. It's like the inability to accept that this well-researched, thought out book might contain some ideas that, even if you don't agree with them, could be valid,
yeah,
is like what people can't
that's
get
right.
their minds around.
That's right. And so, I mean, that's my best advice to people looking for truth, is to take a broader um, point of view, and purposely seek out sources, books, podcasts, take your pick, whatever, news channels that you disagree with, to learn, not just to fume and I guess find fault with, but to really learn, and by the way, to understand issues in a 360 degree, and then form your own opinion. I think that forming your own opinion is one of the fundamental ways back to agency that we can exercise, our agency, which again, I believe, our agency is the most fundamental expression of ourselves. And if we choose to not exercise it, if we choose to just be blown by every whim and wind that blows, and not stand for something, not, to your point, whether we are to be unmoved or whether we are to move with the wind, we still need to choose. Otherwise, we will only ever be moved upon. And we're abdicating what I think is the most eternal expression, I don't know how else to say it, of our
Well, I would
individuality, of our eternal souls, if you choose to believe in that, which I do. And so agency for me is what we are, is what I'm trying to say. Our agency is not something we have. It is literally us, as I see it.
Well, I would argue, if the thing that differentiates a human from an animal is the ability to reason and have free will, then your free will is your agency. That is one and the same. And that's like what you said, like what makes you human. And if I could just offer an analogy that I think is helpful for people holding multiple realities in one space and
Yeah.
like understanding is I'd actually learned this in like a Jewish studies context. So speaking of souls and all of that,
Mm.
um, you know, picture a group of people standing around, they're blindfolded, but they're standing around an elephant. And one person, they all touch the elephant and they all feel something different. And the
Yeah.
person who's standing by the tusk feels like a hard shell and it's cold and they don't know what it feels like. And the person standing by the ear feels like a piece of leather and it feels, soft. And the person by the tail feels like hair and is like, it feels like strands of something. And, the person by the tail, because they're all blindfolded, they're all convinced that they are feeling something different.
Yeah.
This person's feeling ivory, this person's feeling leather, and this person's feeling hair. And you couldn't tell them that they're feeling anything other than what they're feeling, and they'd be right. But take your blindfolds off, and you're all looking at a view of the same thing. And all of those things are true, but they're not the whole truth.
Yeah. Yes, I love that. I love that object lesson. And I think it ties back to where we began, and where you began, which is get out of your earbuds. Here I'm promoting podcasts, I'm promoting reading, but get out of your cocoon, meet people, listen to people, learn to accept people's in person, flesh on flesh point of view. And I think you pair that, if I can summarize a few of the takeaways, seeking honest sources, forget whether you agree with them or not. Look for the honest people who are willing to be mostly honest, even about what they're talking about, and passionate about what they're talking about, as opposed, to just protecting their career. I look for sources that don't have something to lose. What I mean by that is I found some of the best podcasters that I listen to are independently wealthy. They're not controlled, as I perceive it, by media. By the way, I can find these both on the right and the left. I could give you examples. To be really specific, so we don't dance around it. I love listening to Professor Galloway, Prof G,
Oh,
who,
same. The
he
best.
is
Huge fan.
ardently, for
Yes.
instance, a Trump critic. I love listening to the All In podcast. This collection of billionaires who, they don't need advertisers. And by the way, you don't have to agree with what people are saying, but to hear differing point of views and to put yourself, weekly in a position where you're hearing multiple point of views. Just as one dumb example, I think, Prof G is ardently opposed to the All In podcast guys, right? But that's the kind of stuff that I seek out. And I find, and I could give you 10 more. And I find that as I do that, I find great enlightenment, and it allows me, I think, to be a little easier on, I think, everyone around me, whether I agree with them or not, because it breeds empathy. when you're willing to subject yourself to ideas that you don't even agree with. And it allows me to form harder opinions on my own and be in a position to exercise my agency. I could go on forever, but any last thoughts
Yeah.
on how people can be the solution?
Yeah, I think be less dug in and realize you might be looking at a different part of the elephant.
Yeah.
Um,
I love that.
and really, I think try to like, how do I say this? Try when you're in a space where you're arguing, over a political situation, I'll just say that because that's what we've been talking about.
Okay.
Try to be the person that you'd be happy you were an hour after the conversation is over, rather than kind of like losing your cool or letting it get in the way of your relationship. Think about what the conversation you're going to wish you had had
Mm.
when you look back on this conversation would have been.
Yeah. And by the way, I had a thought as you expressed this idea that, what separates us from animals is our agency. And our ability to exercise free will. Our own amygdala, our own lizard brain is
Mhm.
looking to hijack our free will, because we have been
Yes.
programmed through evolution or what have you. And whether it's our own amygdala, whether it's others looking to control us or somehow manipulate us, I think that you're tapping into something fundamental in your book, something eternal in your book, and your whole argument around agency is something that needs to be sought out by those listening. So check out Sami on Twitter, Sami Sage Says, as I do on Instagram, just at Sami, Sami.
Yep.
How cool is
Yep.
that?
Yeah.
And be sure and Betches, of course, at
Betches.
Bitches
Betches
with an E.
News. Yep.
Uh,
Betches News, morning
so much fun.
announcements. You got it
Uh,
all.
Be sure to grab a copy of Sami's New York Times bestseller, Democracy in Retrograde: How to Make Changes Big and Small in Our Country and in Our Own Lives. It's as much self-help as it is politics. It's amazing. And
All
look,
agency.
to the proponent of political discourse, the best-selling brand officer, the bootstrapper of Betches Media herself, Sami Sage. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shawn.
Remember, problems in life and business are inevitable. You are the solution if you choose to be. It just might save you a chunk off your own 25-year journey. Have a good one.
My trip that I do once a year to take my friends away should not be the budget for your bike across America.
TikTok has become an aggregator for some of the dumbest human actions.
When I won that million, I was $2 million in debt, barely hanging on.
Hey, if this message hit home for you, I would love to hear about it. Please drop a comment, shoot me a message, slide into my DMs on Instagram, leave a review on this podcast, give it a 5-star rating. It really makes a difference. We're trying to get this content out there. I think we're producing stuff that's different than the norm because I'm not a pundit. I'm not a media person. I'm not an interviewer. I am a man in the arena. I am a CEO, and the people I have on this podcast are fellow entrepreneurs and doers and movers and shakers. And I think we're having some really special conversations that I know I benefit from. I hope you do too. Your comments and stories and feedback really shape this podcast. Please follow me on Instagram, Shawn of Lovesack. That's where I post inspiration, podcast highlights, real moments of my life and family. You can find me on other social media platforms. I'm everywhere, Shawn of Lovesack, YouTube, all those places. And listen, love is really what we're all about. It's in our name. It's our ticker on Wall Street, the most loveless place on earth, perhaps. It's in our DNA. So share the love, like it, follow it. Most importantly, pass it along to a friend. Share this message or any of our messages with someone who might need to hear it. I am Shawn D. Nelson at Shawn of Lovesack. Thank you so much for listening.